So our very first speaker today is Adam Chong. Adam completed his PhD, if you can see him, in linguistics in 2017 at UCLA. Adam is currently senior lecturer with the Department of Linguistics at Queen Mary University of London. He's also the director of their phonetics lab. He's an experimental phonologist, and his work focuses very much on phonological acquisition and processing, and on prosody and intonation. He has published in many of the best journals in the field, including Journal of Phonetics, Language, Laboratory Phonology, and Infancy. And today's talk is on teasing apart sources of prominence in Singapore English. So thank you, Adam.
Thanks everyone for being here. So I'm going to just jump straight in. So typically if I give this talk, it's usually not in the Singapore context, so this section is a lot longer, but we're going to dive straight in. So as everyone knows in this room, Singapore English is a new or contact variety. And what's important for us is the fact that this comes with it sort of normative or stabilized norms, right? Is there issues with?
We have not projected.
We have not projected the slides.
Yeah.
Important. Okay, great. So as we all know as well, when we start talking about Singapore English, we need to think about essentially what are we actually talking about, right? There's depending on your inclinations, you can either think about Singapore English in terms of a continuum between colloquial and standardized Singapore English, or a diglossic situation. I'm not really going to be weighing into this debate today because from our perspective, the data that we'll be looking at comes from definitely the more standard end, because this is laboratory speech, and specifically as spoken by university-educated Chinese Singaporeans. Right? If any of you have worked on Singapore English, you know that there's a lot of things that go into what predicts production, and our sample is a very limited one. What is today's talk going to be about? So today I'm going to be talking about Singapore English prosody, specifically intonation and rhythm. Well, particularly intonation, actually, so which is the rhythm and melody of sentences. If you don't know much about intonation, this is the thing that can do, that tells you whether something's a declarative or a question, information structure, so something's focused, or even just paralinguistic information, so things like emotion. In the Singapore English context, this is relatively under-examined compared to other segmental, other aspects of Singapore English prosody or phonology and phonetics. Most of the existing work is on segmental features, right? So there's to say features that are like vowels and consonants. Let's jump into what do we know about Singapore English prosody. We're going to start at word level. So this is lexical prosody. So what we might consider stress. So lexical prominence. This is a fairly thorny area in the literature. So there's to say some studies just assume a British English stress system, which we are actually going to be assuming for our purposes. Stress is not really contrastive in the same way it is in some sort of Western varieties of English, at least not in the classical cases like birth and death. Some international models, such as Chow 2016, actually eschew the notion of stress completely. Partly the reason is phonetically, it's not really cued by a higher pitch or F0. Intensity and maybe to a lesser extent duration seem to be more important. But at the same time, across studies, there often is this description that does perceive final prominence on a word. In fact, this goes back to a very early work on the language. So it's quite a bit of a mess, right? So what's going on here? Where there's been quite a bit of work is on Singapore English rhythm. In fact, anyone who hears about Singapore English outside of Singapore tends to know it for the fact that it's been argued to be the sort of prototypical syllable-timed English variety, right, versus stress-timed. And this is often discussed in terms of rhythm metrics. So this is things like respirability index, which is often in terms of measuring alternations in duration and timing, right? So duration of seconds and so on. The issue, though, is the durational variation, so variation across a sentence that can actually arise from a number of different sources, right? It can arise from phrasal phonology, because like final lengthening at the ends of prosodic units. It can arise from, let's say, prominent syllables, or a subset of them, depending on the information structure and so forth, right? And the durational variables themselves don't really tell us anything about what the source of durational differences actually is. Further, in terms of rhythm, these indices are often construed, they tend to ignore other aspects of the signal. So that is to say things like F0 or intensity alternations that can actually, in fact, sometimes do more to influence a rhythmic percent. So this basically doesn't tell us, it tells us something, but it's sort of what exactly it tells us is less clear. In terms of intonation, there's some previous work, but these are primarily in terms of, they haven't really investigated phonological structure per se. That is to say, it's not really what is actually going on under the hood. These are primarily examinations of global tunes and contours, things like, oh, it's a rising contour, it's a falling contour, and so forth. But one thing that seems to be the case in these studies is that there seems to be difficulty in sort of identifying what's the most prominent word or prominent syllable within an utterance, right? So there's something about the fact that everything seems to sound of equal prominence. So how do we disentangle this? Just to kind of summarize what we know about prosodic prominence or intonation in Singapore English, this is what we can get. At the word level, lexical prominence is a little unclear, right? It may be there, it may not be there, it's a weakly cue. But final syllables seem to be perceptually very prominent. At the sentence level, there's no clear most prominent, or if you want to think about it in terms of British school intonation, nuclear accented word or syllable. Rhythmically, it seems to be all very syllable timed. So the question is, how do we actually tie all this together to get an understanding of what's actually the prosodic system, right, of Singapore English? The goal for today's talk is to really dive into this. So we're going to be looking at Singapore English intonation and prosodic prominence as a byproduct of this from a phonological, specifically autosegmental metrical approach, right? And I'm going to show evidence, or at least argue for, the fact that intonation in Singapore English is primarily edge-based, and to say it's used to mark edges of phrasal units, with a less clear importance for lexical prominence. So that's to say lexical stress is less important. I'm not saying it's not there, it's less important, right, in Singapore English. And this is in contrast, if you know anything about how prosodic systems of Western English varieties, right, these are kind of very stress-based. But I'm also going to talk a little bit about the fact there's actually individual variation, maybe not surprisingly, right, in the marking and potentially representation of lexical prominence in our set of speakers, even though our set of speakers, as you shall see, is fairly controlled, right? So what I'd like to get to, hopefully, is the sort of the idea that how we can, once we start considering different levels of prominence and how this works in a phonological system, this actually helps to clarify what is going on in a prosodic system like Singapore English, right? So, just to kind of give some theoretical background. So the current approach is a phonological approach to intonation. So this is the autosegmental metrical approach. I'm just going to call it the AM approach because it's a bit of a mouthful. And so within this approach, which is goes back to Pierre Humbert, 1980, the idea is that tune and text are independent of each other, right? So there's nothing that ties tune and text sort of inherently together to each other. Tunes are composed of high and low, typically abstract tonal targets. These are usually looked at in terms of inflection points. And the important thing to say is that tones of observable F0, that is to say what you see in a pitch track and prat, are actually principal distinct levels, right? So syllables, in fact, most syllables are underspecified for tone. Right? And what you get is language-specific phonetic implementation rules that tell you how you join the dots, right? The dots being tonal targets. But within this framework, we can think about intentional typology. So languages can mark prominence with F0 on a number of different things. Or so you can either mark bits of phrases, and what I mean by this is essentially the subset of lexically stressed syllables, or all stressed syllables. So this is head prominence using pitch accents, right? Or they can also mark phrase edges, right? So edge prominence, that is to say phrase accents or boundary tones, or both. This is sort of, there's multiple layers that are going on here. And this approach has been applied to a typologically diverse set of languages, right? And what's interesting is that some languages only mark phrase edges. So that is to say, there are some languages like Korean, like Chickasaw in North America, many varieties in Malay that don't have lexical stress. All they do is mark phrase edges. And also at the same time, you have languages that have lexical stress, but no actual pitch accents. That is to say, at the sentence level, that phrase, even though there's lexical stress, there's other phonological evidence for stress, right? F0 is only marking phrase edges. So these two things are in principle distinct from each other. Right? There's something important to bear in mind. Okay, so let's then jump into Singapore English. So this is a a fairly standard Singapore English sentence in standard Singapore English. Hopefully the sound will play.
Millennium was an old hotel chain.
I would agree. It's obviously careful speech. It's a sort of like lab controlled environment. It's more standardized. It's clearly not colloquial. But we already can tell if you're, like this is, at least it's a fair enough representation of Singapore English. So what did we notice? A couple things. Firstly, we see across the entire sentence, and this is fairly typical, a series of F0, regular F0 rises, usually encompassing a single content word. A content word and any preceding function words, right? So you have millennium, was an old, was what, hotel, chain, right? And the first rise tends to be the largest. This is very consistent across the data set, across productions, and so forth. And then the subsequent rises tend to be much more compressed, just to give you a lay of the land. So what does this look like from a phonological perspective? So in the phonological model that I proposed a while ago now, I argued that Singapore English, at least structurally, had 3 levels of phonological phrasing. There was the central phrase, which we'll come to in a second, the intermediate phrase, and the intonational phrase, right? So if you're familiar with the prosodic hierarchy, right? Essentially, largest level, middle level, the lowest level, and then the word, which is here. And the AP, which is the central phrase, is sort of the thing that's interesting about Singapore English, because this is something that doesn't occur in other Western varieties. Right? So I argued in sort of the earlier work that I did on this that because of this central phrase, intonation in Singapore English was primarily edge-based, which with this central phrase basically being the domain of this rise. Right? So you have an AP consisting of a single content word and whatever preceding function words there are. So this AP, or this like prosodic unit, is the thing that contains the domain of the rise. The high tone is almost always on the final syllable, and then the L is a bit more complicated, as we shall see. Right? We might not get to the full details, but I'm happy to chat more about that. How does this work? And once we apply it to the sentence, we have millennium, so low high. HA just says it's the right edge of the prosodic unit. Was it all? Chain, and there's some stuff going on in the final utterance boundary to make room to the boundary tone, right? But this helps us parse this entire intonational phrase into 4 different subunits. What the model then tells us at the moment, right? So this is just a qualitative analysis, is that there are different sources of prominence. We have lexical prominence from prosody stress positions, and then we have phrasal prominence that has accentual phrases and higher levels of intermediate and intonational phrases. So the question that we're going to be looking at in the data today is, well, what are the correlates of these different sources of prominence? And specifically, how much understanding this help us understand previous observations that we kind of laid out previously. In brief, we're going to look at very briefly, this is the less interesting stuff, like what are the durational correlates of an accentual phrase? And then we're going to spend more time on sort of within an AP, how does lexical prominence mark? The data for this was actually collected at NTU. This was a decade ago at this point. These are all Chinese participants, so they're all bilingual. And they were asked to read sentences aloud as though they were talking to a friend, right? Still obviously more standard. This is definitely not conversation speech. So we're going to just talk about phrasal prominence first. So it says phrasal prominence, pre-bound 3 lengthening. So if you are familiar at all with any work on prosodic phrasing, you'll be familiar with the fact that at the ends of prosodic units, things tend to be lengthened. So the ends of phrases, things tend to be lengthened. And previous work has shown in many languages that the degree of lengthening also correlate with where you are in the prosodic hierarchy. So that as you go higher, you get more lengthening. So we're going to use this fact to try and basically find sort of a acoustic correlate of what we think is phonological structure that's there. Right? Specifically, that we should find a degree of lengthening in between the word level and this higher level big IP. You can ask me about the little intermediate thing here. That's a bit more complicated, but this is where we started out. So we have sentences like these. So the difficulty in Singapore English is that content words reliably get a high tone, so you can't really manipulate that much. But with things like ellipsis, so this is where you take away the verb, we can actually get the same target word in principle different phrasal divisions, right? So he said he will is IP final. He said he will tomorrow is AP final, and then he said he will go tomorrow is word final. What we found was, I won't show you the data here, but you can just take my word for it, is the fact that we actually found a degree of lengthening that was essentially a three-way contrast. Words at he said he will was longer than AP final, AP finally, which were then longer than just word final. We're seeing essentially durational increases as the size of the prosodic boundary increases, right? Which suggests that overall, AP final syllables are longer, also have a high F0 because of the high tone that's associated with it. Word final. Seeing now, actually sort of clarifying that actually there's some level of prosodic structure there that we didn't really think about before. So moving on from there, the more sort of interesting question is, what's going on about lexical prominence? Because this is where in Singapore English, it's all very muddy, right? So just to kind of remind ourselves of the main facts, F0 tends to not correlate with stress, at least as far as it's been measured previously. Intensity and duration seem to be more important. Some models seem to not do stress, and then final syllables are often perceived as prominent. So what's going on here? So one thing that we need to address is the fact that some work has made the argument that stress syllables in Singapore English are assigned a midtone. So this is, if you're familiar with work by M, this is the tone and stress sort of pattern that she's argued for. And under her model, argues that all final syllables are high tones, any stress syllables get a midtone, and then any pre-stress syllables are low tones. Right? So you get this interpolation or specified tones for stress and between stress and final syllables. Right? Kind of get this in principle contrast, right, between low, mid, and high. Although it's not really clear, so necessarily sort of once you get in the sentence level, how the difference between an M and an L tone, right? So we wanted to test this very explicit model using essentially acoustic measures. What can we say? Under Ng's model, the main differences for a word with initial versus medial stress, if they're trisyllabic, should emerge on the first syllable, right? Because in a word like Melanie versus Manila, right? So Melanie is initially stressed, Manila is medially stressed, right? The tonal patterns based on her algorithm should be mid-mid-high versus low-mid-high. This means is her initial stress will be something like this, medial stress something like that. The first syllable is the place that we might expect to see differences based on stress pattern. That's all. And that because these are level tones, we should kind of expect to see these differences just observable from units. This is sort of a very sort of baseline place to start. What did we find? So we basically looked at words disyllabic and trisyllabic in different stress patterns in sentence initial position. And what we found was, you see here is F0. First and second syllable, first, second, third for three syllabic words. The red lines are always going to be stress initial, and the blue lines are always going to be non-stress and stress non-initial because it's either final or medial. Right? Across all speakers, we find that, not surprisingly, the final syllable is always associated with a high. That's great. So that's a sanity check. But stress syllables, stress initial words, regardless of or trisyllabic, were always just associated with overall rise. That will then say stress stress final or stress words. So given what we said before, this is not really showing or panning out with kind of predictions, right? If we dive into the data more concretely, so these are, don't worry, I'm going to pass this down, right, one by one. These are essentially raw F0 measures across the target word of words of target words and essential phrases of different sizes. So on the top here, top left is one syllable word, so it's like Ben, right? On the right-hand side is like disyllables, trisyllables, and three syllable but multi-word cases. So things like he will go, he will. Firstly, let's look at the monosyllables. Actually, going back, notice that from a broad impressionistic level, the tonal contours look very similar regardless of the constituency, the size, and the stress consent. It's low high, that's it. We don't really see necessarily level target differences. But you might see, as along the way, like differences in sort of details of when that rise occurs. In one syllable cases, basically a low versus high. Right? The highs in almost all the cases are always aligned very late in the target word. So it doesn't tell, it sort of suggests that maybe the H itself is not really the main target for that word, right? When we look at disyllables and trisyllables that include only single word targets, right? We notice that the red lines in both of these cases, right? The red line, remember, is always stress initial, right? What's different between the red and blue line is the fact that red lines to rise earlier than the blue line. The blue line waits to the second syllable, right, or the final syllable in the disyllabic cases before rising. So what this is potentially indicative of is that actually instead of a tone level difference, what's different actually between stressed initial or stressed medial cases is actually a timing of when the rise starts. So this is basically a tonal alignment issue. And we can see that once you look at trisyllabic words, whether or not it's a single word or multi-words, you find that there's a similar type of pattern to, right? Where you can say, for example, the red case here, if we want to concentrate on this dot there, this is a thing like he murmured, right? So murmured has simple initial stress, right? We find that the red line here also starts to rise earlier. And so basically the same pattern as we expect in syllables. So once you dive into the data, we find actually that it's maybe not a height issue, but actually an alignment issue. Interesting though, too, is that the degree to which individual speakers, and this is only a set of 24 speakers who are all Chinese, all university, right? The degree to which they actually distinguish between stress initial and stress medial or final words differs. So on the left-hand panel here, this is F0. So if you recall, thing goes up to the right, which is great. But the speaker on the left shows a bigger difference between the red line and the blue line, right? Stress initial versus stress medial. Before, on the right-hand side, doesn't really. The marginal difference, but we're talking here, a difference of 5 hertz, which is way below the GND for tonal differences. Sensible difference. And on the right-hand side, this is durational differences, right? So we might expect that stressed syllables are longer than unstressed syllables, and we see that to some extent that's true for speaker 1 and for speaker 4 as well, but it's less clear for trisyllables in speaker 4. So that's to say the red lines here are basically parallel again, which is a bit unexpected if they're making some differences. So even within a kind of, so not only is there sort of different differences in alignment, whether speakers are potentially doing the same thing is probably not clear. Okay. So I'm just going to summarize things here. So firstly, there's no clear evidence to support the claim of the tone stress association, right? Instead of this picture, we actually get this picture instead, well, grossly sort of generalizing. Each word or AP, so even if there's multiple words, tends to be characterized by a similar rising contour, regardless of size and constituency. There's a possible role for F0 alignment, specifically where the L occurs, where the L starts going up, essentially, to the stress level. This is also not clearly the same across participants. There's sort of some variation there as well. How do we then use this to think about prominence? So firstly, as we said before, for English intonation is primarily phrase, edge marking. So AP final syllables, so syllables at the end of phrases, a longer duration and higher F0. So this is honestly the most prominent, right? Because if you saw as well the kind of magnitude of the rises here, final syllable is often a larger rise than anything else. Right? So it's very prominent. There's some support for certain syllables being lexical prominence, right? Within a lexical, but the acoustic measures are sort of, they don't distinguish them to the extent that they distinguish the final syllable. The final syllable seems to be doing a lot of work, essentially. How do we then think about this from the perspective of rhythm? So we want to think about rhythmic structure from phonological structure, right? Now that we've got a better idea of the phonological system, we can start thinking about, well, what is the source of the purported rhythmic differences between British English and say British English and Singapore English, right? So in the language of British English, the relevant positions that can kind of cause durational variation are syllables that are lexically marked for stress, right, including primary and secondary stress, right? A subset of these that get pitch accented, because not all stressed syllables are pitch accented. And then a subset of syllables that are also near phrase boundaries. I have a number of different things that can kind of do this durational variation. In Singapore English, on the other hand, the primary syllables, this is primarily syllables occurring at the AP boundary, right? And obviously higher level prosodic structure, but possibly weaker role for basically determined stress. The durational differences there are not that strong. In terms of the number of positions that can contribute to essentially durational variation, there are fewer in Singapore, which can explain potentially why you might find that they're more syllable timed. And there's also generally less variability in the AP marking. The kind of the rising contour is very consistent across papers. So what does this mean from a kind of intonational typology perspective? So Singapore English has what Sana Chan has called a higher macro rhythm than British or American English. That is to say, it has just more regular tonal alternations. Right? If you've done music, right, you know tonal alternations really give rise as well to these like rhythmic groupings. And it shows less consistent marking with F0 at least than say British or American English. This potentially puts it in a topologically interesting class of languages that have lexical stress, but where intonation is used primarily for phrase edge marking. Right? So what this tells us then is sort of using a phonological approach and sort of starts shedding light on the potential structures that kind of influence prosodic variability, and allows us to also place Singapore English within a wider international typology. What this also highlights, and sort of zooming out a little bit, is the contribution of new or contact language varieties to the understanding of international typology more broadly. Most of the work that people have done for looking at typology has kind of ignored a lot of these contact varieties, right? Because these are often in lingual communities, right? Whether or not prosodic representations themselves are actually uniform across the population. So this is a good testing ground for theoretical model. Just to kind of finish off with some open questions. So now that we can start thinking about specific intonational features, we can start asking the question, well, which of these are actually manipulated by speakers? And which of these are core to the system? Well, English listeners seem to be able to identify the ethnicity, right, of the speaker. This kind of interacts with a bunch of things, right? But what details are in the signal actually are driving this? Right? And do these intonational features co-vary with segmental ones? Because we know a lot about segmental features, right? And like how people manipulate them. How does this actually co-vary? And do different registers or lex, I'm thinking here very specifically about colloquial Singapore English or Singlish, right? How does this fit into the model? Should it be one model? Should it be two? How does it work? How do discourse particles fit in? So now we can actually start asking these questions and actually trying to answer them within a framework. And there's also a question of acquisition. How is this acquired? Given the variability of linguistic ecology, right? What exactly is the input? Right? And how much of this adult system that we see here is going to be influenced by literacy, education, exposure to non-Singapore English, given that everyone in Singapore watches media, they're very well traveled, right? How does this all work? Some work that Jasper has done in the past, right? So this is some data from children. These are primary school, nursery kids, right? I think, and of different ethnic and mother tongue backgrounds. So you have the red line here, the Chinese, English dominant Chinese speakers, and then the blue and green lines here are Malay children, right? Both Malay dominant and English dominant. So what we see is the global pattern is very similar to what we saw before, right? This is rise and then rise, right? But the main difference between the Chinese speakers, the red ones, right, and the Malay speakers, right, tends to be the scaling of that. This allows us to then start thinking, well, phonological sort of targets are probably the same. It's what this phonetic implementation of like how much of that rise or the scaling might actually be manipulated by speaker. We can ask questions about, well, is this something that people are actually sensitive to? Just to conclude, what we found today is essentially evidence to support a phonological model of Singapore English, right? And how a phonological approach actually starts verifying previous observations that people were sort of, that were disparate across the field. It also highlights, I think, the important contribution that these kinds of varieties actually make to theorizing about international typology. A lot of the work is only now just beginning. So where we are going right now is, I have some data that is covered by this, that's tackling stress perception and focus production in Singapore English and looking at the variation head on. So we have like set of data that is very large at the moment, that hasn't looked at, that hopefully will help elucidate what's going on with the variability aspect. So that's all I have for you today. Before I finish, I just want to acknowledge my collaborator on a lot of this work, James German, who was at NTU, but he's in France, and a bunch of people and audiences that have listened to this talk in the past. Thanks.